Yoni Stern is a first-year Azrieli Fellow who comes from the Department of Psychology at the University of Haifa. And Yoni will be speaking to us today about can we find it before we lose it? I like that. I like that title. Can we find it before we lose it? Early detection of schizophrenia. Bevakasha, Yoni.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. Let's see if we can get this.
And welcome to Mr. Joseph Stern. Yoni, is that your father?
Hi, Abba. Thanks for coming.
Welcome.
So, hi. Right. Hi. I want to introduce you to Alon, 27 years old. I'm meeting him for an assessment at a clinic where I'm training as a psychologist. And when I ask him what brings him in, he says, listen, I'm not crazy. Now, Alon doesn't look crazy. He's well-dressed and pleasant to talk to, but he explains, I don't feel like myself. It's as though I'm only 70% of who I used to be. And it all started in the army when he smoked nice guys instead of cannabis that doesn't show up in drug tests. After which he started having these panic attacks that go on for weeks and months. He says he feels as though his body isn't listening to him. It's moving slower than I want it to. Talking to you now, he says, it's as though I'm looking at myself from here, from outside. And when I offer him a glass of water, he refuses, later explaining he's afraid I may somehow have cannabis on my fingertips that could then get into his glass of water. And for similar reasons, he can't go out to a bar or even to his friend's wedding because he's terrified of the secondhand smoke or someone doping his drink. And Alon's in distress, and he keeps on asking, what's going on with me? And I'm asking myself the same question, and I'm also trying to understand, are Alon's experiences early signs of schizophrenia? And to understand this question, let's talk about the mental illness schizophrenia. So it literally comes from the Greek words, a split mind, and it has many different clinical appearances and symptoms. But a core feature of it is psychosis, losing contact with reality, hallucinating, being disconnected from yourself, feeling as though your own body, actions, or even thoughts are not your own. As depicted in this drawing by a schizophrenic artist, he feels as though he's a hollow puppet being controlled by these black lines that are being pulled by an unseen puppet master. And the stereotype that comes to mind when we say schizophrenia is often a madman in a mental asylum, like this one, painted by Goya in the 19th century. Now, unfortunately, the situation today hasn't changed enough. People suffering from schizophrenia often struggle to live a full life, are in and out of psychiatric hospitalizations, and find themselves on the outskirts of society. And to understand how we can treat schizophrenia, we need to understand how it develops. So we know that there's a strong genetic contribution that, together with environmental factors like stress, lead to the onset of a first psychotic episode during young adulthood, after which there's typically chronic illness and repeated hospitalization. But looking at this graph, you can see that schizophrenia doesn't happen all of a sudden. It's preceded by this earlier phase in which there are more mild psychotic symptoms, general psychiatric symptoms like anxiety, depression, and a decline in functioning. And this early phase has given rise to the idea of early intervention. And the rationale is that if we can catch the disease during its early phase, then the impact of our intervention will be much greater than at later stages when it's already fixed. And indeed, research shows that intervening with a combination of antipsychotic medication, psychological and social support can greatly improve the quality of life of people with schizophrenia. But to intervene, we need to identify who's at this early phase. And so this has led to the development of a specialized assessment from which we can diagnose whether a person's at the early phase or so-called at-risk stage of schizophrenia. And so returning to Alon, that's exactly the assessment that we were doing, trying to understand his disturbing experiences. So when Alon describes panic attacks that go on for weeks and months, much longer than the typical minutes or hour an attack usually lasts, I'm trying to understand, are these indeed panic attacks or perhaps are mild psychotic episodes? And his fear of consuming marijuana, is this extreme phobia or perhaps it's the start of a paranoid thought process? And these are tough and confusing questions. And so, unfortunately, research shows that even if we take individuals that did do this interview and are diagnosed as being at risk, only about a third of them go on to actually develop schizophrenia. So as clinicians, we're faced with some tough dilemmas. For example, should Alon be prescribed antipsychotic medication? If he's at the start of a psychotic episode, this can be extremely beneficial. On the other hand, the medication has serious side effects that could make other symptoms, like his social withdrawal, even worse. What should we focus on in therapy, psychotic symptoms or anxiety? How urgent is Alon's case? I'm seeing him in a public mental health clinic in Israel, so needless to say, there's a long waiting list. Where in the queue should we put him? And all of these dilemmas highlight the fact that our current ability to detect who's at risk is a major barrier in effective treatment. And we just don't have a good enough understanding of what's going on during this critical illness phase. So as a cognitive neuroscientist in my research, I'm interested in understanding the changes in cognitive processes that go on during the early stages of schizophrenia. And if we understand these changes, we can then use them to develop new and improved methods to allow us to identify who's at risk. And in my research, I'm specifically trying to do this by two ways. So first, I'm looking at how stress affects cognitive performance. So as part of the assessment, Alon does these standard cognitive tests. And they're done in a quiet, sterile room with no distraction. But the problem is that this is about as different an environment that you can get than the stressful environment in which psychosis actually occurs. So in our study, we're looking at performance in a neutral condition as typically done, but also what happens when we induce mild psychological stress, telling people that they're being filmed, that there's a committee judging them and their performance is being compared to other people, sort of like presenting at an Azrieli forum, right? We predict that individuals that are at greater risk will be more affected by the stress and will be easier to detect their cognitive impairments. The second way we aim to improve early detection is by taking the real world clinical symptoms as they're experienced by the patients and bringing them into the lab so we can test and understand them. And we do this using virtual reality, in which we can create altered psychotic-like experiences. So drawing on this feeling that you don't control your body, we've developed a VR task in which you put on the headset and you're in this nice outdoor porch and there's a butterfly you need to catch. So it looks something like this. And the beauty in VR is that I can easily insert a temporal delay between the movements that you make and the movements that you experience. So in reality, it looks something like this. And after you try to catch the butterfly, I can then ask you, was the movement that you made and the movement that you saw the same? And how confident are you in your response? And from this, I can derive the person's explicit awareness or sensitivity to his body's movements. I can also look at what happens to your body during these altered experiences, looking at your eye movement, hand kinematics, and changes in heart rate, allowing us to build a cognitive and physiological model of what goes on during these psychotic-like experiences. So we took this task and we administered it to chronic schizophrenic patients, and we found several interesting things. First, we found that schizophrenics in gold were significantly impaired at detecting changes to their movements. So they're way below, their sensitivity is way below healthy controls in blue. And this is in line with previous work. Next, we found that looking at their confidence ratings, how well they think they're doing the task, there's no difference between the groups. So despite being especially poor at this task, schizophrenics are sure that they're doing it just as well as controls and that they're fine. And this is an important clinical insight. Next, we wanted to see whether based on task performance, we can classify and say who's healthy and who's schizophrenic. And using a simple classifier in just the first 5 minutes of the task, we were able to reach 80% classification accuracy. Now, this is impressive, but you should also remember that these are chronic patients. So talking to them for 2 minutes, you could probably reach even better levels of accuracy. But this is a proof of concept that our task is capturing core clinical features of schizophrenia and that in the future it could be developed into an app and used in telemedicine to monitor symptoms from afar. And so to sum it up, in my research now, we're combining these two elements I shared with you, looking at the effect of stress on cognitive performance and using VR to create these altered psychotic-like experiences. And we've started a large-scale study in which we're looking at this in different stages of schizophrenia. So we're looking at healthy controls, individuals that are at risk to develop schizophrenia, and people after their first psychotic episode. And we're trying to understand what in these cognitive processes goes wrong at the different stages, and which of these changes can predict who's at greater risk to develop schizophrenia. And so, returning to Alon's question, what's going on with me? It's my hope that this research will allow us to give him a slightly better answer, and importantly, to better help us in assisting these young adults that are coping with their unique challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Yoni. Very interesting. We're opening the floor now to questions. Are there any questions? Is there someone?
Tamar, Mikala,
Wasn't sure if I should talk or not. Can I ask a question
Yeah,
now?
please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So at the beginning, you talk about the cognitive tests and the induction of stress. So I wanted to know if you're seeing differences, what you're seeing there, and what cognitive tests are being given. It's like the mathematics or like counting backwards, those kind of tests, or something else.
Right. So I think I understand your question correctly. So we're looking at differences in both how people react to the stress, healthy individuals and individuals that are at risk. And we are seeing differences. So people that are at risk for schizophrenia, they experience higher levels of stress or more, it's harder for them, the situation. We see changes in their heart rate variability, which is a measure of stress. So they're more stressed out. And the tasks that we're looking at in our study are actually not the standard mathematics, memory, attention. We're looking at these VR tasks in which you're trying to identify your movement. And here we still have very preliminary data. So it's hard, I don't want to say like what happens in people that are at risk. From pilot data in which we did it at healthy individuals, we actually found that the stress slightly improves your performance. And so we know that stress, you want to have a bit of stress, like presenting now, I'm a bit stressed out, it makes me a bit more faster, what's called the inverted U-shape effect, right? So in healthy individuals, mild stress actually enhances their ability. We see them do slightly better.
Yoni, may I have a question? So first of all, thank you. It was extremely interesting. And my question is, what was the severity level of the schizophrenia in the patients that you had? I mean that I remember, I'm a medical doctor and I'm not a psychiatrist, but I remember from my days at the psychiatric hospitals that there is quite a large range from schizophrenic patients who are completely gone to the ones that are quite stable and are given drugs and they can perform all kinds of tasks. So I'm wondering, how did you control this matter?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the chronic patients were very chronic. So we did the study at Be'er Yaakov, a psychiatric hospital, and these are patients that came in, it's an open ward, but they're being stabilized, they're all on antipsychotic medication. And so their functioning is it's not an outburst of the psychotic episode, but they've already been stabilized, but they're still at the hospital. So they're very extreme. So it's not representative of all schizophrenics. And like you said, it's important to remember that it's very heterogeneous, the population. Some function very highly and some function very poorly. to control for it, we looked at their clinical measures, something called PANS, and we entered that into the statistics. But yeah, I mean, it's right. You're right in the sense that this is sort of an extreme example. It's the far end of the spectrum, people that are at the hardest point. But now we're trying to look at people that are also at more like lighter levels, earlier stages.
Thank you.
So you deal with people that already were classified with having schizophrenia?
Right. So we did one study in chronic patients. So they were already administered to the hospital and they've already been diagnosed as schizophrenic. In our study now, we're part of a clinic, an outpatient clinic in Rambam Hospital, in which people come, they're still living at their home, and they come because there's some fear of them being at the early stages of schizophrenia. So something's off, but they're still living at home. They're not being classified. And we do assessments to them to try to understand whether or not they're in the so-called early stage of schizophrenia. So these are relatively high functioning people, and it's still sort of in the question whether or not what's going to happen to them, and we're trying to follow them and look at their cognitive performance. So in our study now, they don't have schizophrenia yet, or they're after the first psychotic episode. So
they approach to you because they feel they have like anxiety?
Yes, so it's a good question how you find them. So I mean, we both have, so what we do and other people do, they either they approach us or they're being sent to us by, they came to see a therapist because they're feeling distress. It looks like anxiety, but when you start talking to them, you suddenly see that they have sort of bizarre thoughts or maybe bizarre behavior. And then they say, okay, wait, we need to, they'll send them to us to see whether or not, something else is going on. And some of them, we have an online website and there's a questionnaire in which you can fill out, and it serves as a sort of screener. And people that get above a certain score on the questionnaire, then we leave them the option that we could contact them back if they're interested in, and then we contact them. And the questionnaire looks at sort of all these different altered experiences. Yeah.
Thank you. Your work is so meaningful.
Thank you.
So you talk about patients as a group. Did you differentiate between men and women?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a major problem in our research and all of the research in schizophrenia, that it's very, very heterogeneous, both gender-wise and functioning-wise, as we said beforehand. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's hard to collect people to participate in these studies and recruiting them, and that is hard. So we control for gender differences. In the chronic patients, it was mainly men, not women, and that's sort of, I don't know, what we had. So it's limited. And in the current study, I mean, we're trying to collect whoever comes, and we added into the models, the statistical models, trying to control for it, but it's far from perfect. So is there a specific reason why you'd expect differences?
Yes, we look at gene expression in the brain. It's totally different. We look at gene expression in blood samples, totally different. The dosage of therapeutics are given the same, although side effects were shown to be totally different for men and women with this and other diseases. So I'm really worried about half of the world being treated by drugs that were developed and tested for the other half. And I'm afraid it's going on.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I keep getting to review papers, and I say, okay, you studied 40 patients, out of whom 11 were women. Can you please separate the populations? Oh, no, then we will lose statistical significance, but we use math to correct. No, you can't use math to correct for real differences. There are people behind that. And I'm seriously concerned. I don't know.
Right. I mean, just So yeah, we know also in schizophrenia that the illness progression is different between men and women. Men tend to have it earlier, although there's sort of equal odds. Men's prognosis is worse than women's. Just to clarify, I don't know about it.
Men get addicted to smoking and women don't. So
Mhm,
that
right.
goes to my field of expertise, which is cholinergic signaling. So
Right.
we know they're different, but nobody is doing anything to correct that.
Right.
That's very bad in my eyes.
Oh, it's good that you raised that, Mona, because this is something that needs to be in minded. It's not always possible, as I hear you saying, to collect I see the difficulty in collecting the people that will participate in your research.
Yeah.
But it's important to be minded to the gender difference as much as you can. Any other questions?
I wanted to ask, please. First of all, thank you. It was fascinating. And I was wondering whether those symptoms necessarily point out schizophrenia, or maybe they can indicate on other syndromes, such as PTSD, which sometimes has similar clinical appearance.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question, Hagit. And indeed, research shows that people that are at risk, only a third of them go on to develop schizophrenia, but a lot of them go on to develop other stuff. It could be PTSD, it could be depression, anxiety. And this has sort of raised a question in the field whether these people are actually specifically at risk for schizophrenia, or maybe these are people with sort of more severe mental health issues that can go, it can end up in a variety of ways. And yeah, so it's a major concern. So actually, I didn't go into this in my study, but actually in our study now, as a control group, an additional control group, we're collecting people that come to the clinic, to the general psychiatric clinic for different reasons, but they aren't diagnosed as being at risk for schizophrenia. So we have people with severe anxiety, severe depression, PTSD, and we're trying to see also whether our test can differentiate them from other people. And that's really sort of the hard part. Teasing apart, people that have serious problems, but is it schizophrenia or is it something else that's really bothering them?
Any other questions? Scrolling through, has anyone raised their hand? No? Okay. So, Yoni, I want to thank you very much. It's fascinating talk, and good luck with your research.
Thank you.
It's really important in many aspects.